You missed us.
I did miss you. I did miss you. The first Sunday there, I worshiped in a Romanian Orthodox church in Ireland. That was very interesting. And the second Sunday, I worshiped in the Holy Spirit Church in Heidelberg, which was the source of the Heidelberg Catechism, which was also very interesting. Very different services. So, yeah, quite something. It's Transfiguration Sunday, and it was very interesting. There was an article in the Reformed Journal where the person said that the Transfiguration is a tough sell, and he didn't quite know what to do with the Transfiguration, and he went in kind of an interesting direction with it. I'm more inclined to agree with my buddy Eric Dirksen, who was tweeting up a storm, all sorts of historical takes on the Transfiguration by church fathers. And he had a tweet that said, bit of a scandal, the church order of the Christian Reformed Church doesn't include the Transfiguration in its list of worship services that ought to be held. And so in many lectionaries, this is Transfiguration Sunday. But, in a little while, Easter will come, and everybody knows Easter. And, of course, Christmas comes, and everybody knows Christmas. Few people know Pentecost, fewer yet Ascension Day. Very few people know about the Transfiguration. It's a little harder to sort of get your mind around. But why do we, in the course of a year, look at Christmas and Easter and Pentecost and Ascension? Or Ascension Sunday. Part of it is to take these things that seem sort of trapped in time and to bring them into our lives. And it helps us have a sense that we just sang the song, I want Jesus to walk with me. As we go through the calendar of our year, in a sense we go through the calendar of Jesus' story. We have his birth, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension, but then there's this transfiguration. Now, we've been going through the Gospel of Luke, and the transfiguration is in the Gospel of Luke. And the story of the transfiguration starts like this. About 8 days after Jesus said this. Now, in a minute, we'll have to say, oh, okay, sometimes people wonder, well, why does the pastor sort of expand the texts that are in the lectionary? It's because if you're reading along in your Bible and you start here and you say, after Jesus said this, you should probably say, after Jesus said what? So we'll get to that. But the other point is about 8 days after, which you might think, well, so what? 8 days in Jewish tradition is kind of important because if you look at the creation story, on the seventh day, God did what? He rested from all of his work. So on the 8th day, in a sense, creation commences. Now, Christians picked up on this in terms of the 8th day because if you think about the 7th day is the Sabbath. What day did Jesus rise from the dead on? It was a Sunday, which is the 8th day, if you start sort of counting in a Jewish way. And so the church fathers saw 8th day as Resurrection Day. So already, crafty Luke is sending us a signal connecting something that he's not yet written about with what's about to happen. But before we get to that, we have to figure out what Jesus had been saying because that's connected with what's about to happen. Back to earlier in Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9 is an incredibly important chapter, actually, in the Gospel of Luke. Once when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him. Now here again is kind of an interesting Part of what happens is you just sort of read through the Bible. You say, okay, I'm going to read a chapter. Kind of read through the whole chapter, and then something will sort of pop out. And it's these little details that if you slow down, you might say, Jesus is praying in private and his disciples are with him. Well, what does that mean? Because if I would say I'm praying in private, I would probably think I'm praying alone. But for Jesus, private means, well, this is how intimately he was with his disciples. So he's living in the midst of all of these crowds. Everyone wants to see Jesus. And so this is just him and his disciples. Now, we don't know, when he says disciples, that might mean the 12. But we do also know from a whole bunch of reasons that the disciples could mean as many as 72. So how many people are with him? We don't know, but Jesus, we've seen again and again in the Gospel of Luke, gets away to pray, and he prays in private, away from the crowds, and he's praying in private with his disciples, and everything in the Gospel of Luke has been the crowds. They're always after him. Jesus can't get any peace, so he has to go way out into the wilderness to pray, and then he stops, and he's got his disciples around, and he says, who do the crowds say that I am? Because Jesus has made a big splash. Jesus has done a lot of miracles. Jesus has been teaching. And so Jesus wants to know, what category, what box do they put me in? They replied, some say John the Baptist. At this point, apparently, John the Baptist had already been killed. And so maybe people thought they weren't there at his baptism where Jesus and John are in the same place. So maybe people are thinking like Clark Kent and Superman. You never see him in the same place at the same time. So some say John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, the great prophet of Israel. But still others, one of the prophets from long ago that has come back to life. So everyone has a sense that their world stands at a precipice. Do you feel that way sometimes? The world stands at a precipice, and everything's going to change, and God's about to act, and so God has sent a prophet in our midst, and that's probably what most people think of as Jesus, because he's doing miracles, and he's preaching, and he has the attention of everyone. And then Jesus says, okay, that's the crowds, but here we are in private. You are with me 24/7. You live with me. When we lay down to rest, we're all laying down to rest together in the wilderness. You guys see me all the time. Who do you say that I am? What category have you placed me in? Peter answered, God's Messiah. Now, part of what's been interesting about being on the internet is I have a whole diversity of voices who talk to me and give me comments. They watch these. I do a rough draft of these sermons often on Saturday, and some of them watch the live stream on Sunday, and they have a lot of pushback on my sermons. You're a very polite audience and usually just listen to what I have to say, but people on the internet, not so much. I'm going to tell you something about human beings. They have opinions, believe it or not. And on the internet, when they have opinions, they leave comments. And I'm not one who likes to turn off the comments. I would rather hear the opinions that people have, positive or negative. And Jesus is doing the same thing. He's listening to them. And so many of my Jewish friends have said, you know, the Jews believe in lots of different kinds of messiahs. Oh. And so when Peter said God's Messiah, God's anointed one, the one we've been waiting for, that's kind of a broad category because they've all got these expectations. Now, this morning at 9 o'clock at our estuary meeting, if you've never been to estuary at 9 o'clock, you should really come sometime because it's a lovely group and we have a good time. We'll talk about anything in our estuary group, and so the Trump-Zelensky thing is just a buzz in the culture right now. And everybody has all sorts of assumptions and expectations about how a president should behave, how Zelensky should behave. And everybody sort of has assumptions based on a role about what things will happen afterwards. And all that's built into this Messiah thing. And Jesus warns them not to tell anyone this. Jesus says, and this is strange, don't go using that word with respect to me. Well, why not, Jesus? Why not? If you would ask most Christians today about who's the Messiah, Jesus. Why not let everybody know, Jesus, that you're sent by God to save Israel? Because everybody hearing that will say, oh, good. Finally, and then they've all got their ideas about how God is supposed to do this. And probably most of them would involve angel armies, or handing out swords, or burning down cities, or killing Gentiles, or Roman soldiers. Most would have ideas about that. Because they have stories of David, who killed Goliath and the Philistines. And not too long before, the Maccabees rose up, and when the Greeks were sort of conquering them, the Maccabees rose up and had a successful revolt and pushed back the Greeks. And so when they hear Messiah, they have ideas. And so Jesus says, don't use that word about me in public, because it sets me in a direction in their minds. And then he says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders. Now again, we've talked about this before. The Son of Man comes from Daniel 7, and it's a story. Now keep these pieces in mind. In the story of Daniel 7, there's a great sea. And out of the sea come sea monsters, and they ravage the earth. And when you watch the news and you look at Russia and Ukraine fighting, and Europe and America, and there's the specter of nuclear weapons out there. That's sort of like the sea and the monsters. And then in that story, the Ancient of Days, the God of Israel, comes and sets thrones and basically says to the sea and the monsters, silence! And they're all quiet. And then clouds of heaven come, and there's one like a Son of Man who descends from heaven, and the Ancient of Days gives him an eternal kingdom over the sea and the monsters and the chaos and the torment of the world. So Jesus is really tricky when he uses that term. And he said, Messiah, don't use that word. What word has Jesus been using, Son of Man? How would the Romans understand that? They wouldn't understand it at all. How would the children of Israel understand that? They'd think, oh, the book of Daniel. Oh, Jesus is going to quell the nations. How? And then he says this. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. Wait a minute. This one descending from heaven is going to be rejected by the authorities of God's own people? That's not in the script. And must be killed. Well, that's certainly not in the script. And of course, once they hear killed, you know how it just happened actually. Someone was out ringing doorbells at 3 in the morning last week and rang the doorbell of a neighbor who I also know. And the mother of the house, her son was down in Ripon visiting some family and hadn't come home yet. So when the doorbell rang at 3 in the morning, what does a mother think about? Where's my boy? Where's my boy? Is my boy safe? She flies out of bed, and it was someone else. I won't mention who he was, but some of you know. And when they hear Jesus say, I'm going to Jerusalem, and all of the authorities of God's people are going to collaborate with the people that you think should die, and they're going to kill me, their ears turn off. And we know that because Easter Sunday morning, who's at the grave? Are Jesus' disciples all at the grave waiting for him, saying, Jesus told us he would come, Jesus told us he would be here? No, they're hiding still. A few bold women come. Why? They're going to continue embalming him. So nobody hears what Jesus has to say. But Jesus says, he must, the Son of Man who descends from heaven, must be killed and on the third day raised to life. And that is in no one's picture of what Peter just declared and what Jesus just has asked about who Jesus is. Then he said to them, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. Now again, some of you might have nice little gold crosses around your neck, and it's very pretty, and we've got a cross in back and one way up there, and everybody sees a cross. And the red cross is where, people are going to come to help with bandages and aid and water and food. But in the Roman world, the cross is the means by which the Romans humiliated and killed their political adversaries of low social status. If you were a runaway slave in Rome, you would expect a cross as punishment for your insurrection. And when later there was a Jewish revolt, the Romans put over 500 crosses of revolutionaries along the highway. Can you imagine if there was a revolt here in Sacramento and the government decided they were going to crucify naked 500 revolutionaries down I-5 between here and Elk Grove? We know what message that would send. Jesus says, whoever must be my disciple must take up their cross. What does that mean? Daily. And follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Well, everybody wants to save their life. You think about Ukraine and America and we, nukes. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Oh, that doesn't sound very good. But whoever loses their life for me will save it. Jesus, you're so confusing. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and the holy angels. So the holy angels are coming. Okay, when, how, why, to do what? Truly, I tell you, some are standing here who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God. And that line still sort of confounds us. Do you mean in terms of what they're about to see in the next story? Maybe. Do you mean the crucifixion? Maybe. Do you mean the resurrection? Maybe. Do you mean the day of Pentecost? Maybe. Do you mean the kingdom of God is at hand? Do you mean the kingdom of God is among us? Maybe. Do you mean the church? Maybe. So about 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. Now that's, again, we've seen pretty normal. But just now, the three and him. And as he was praying, now this is where things get strange, because they prayed with him all the time, but this time, as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Have you ever been outside and it's totally dark, maybe a moonless night, and then you see lightning? If you close your eyes right after you see that, you can still see the lightning in your eyes. It's that bright. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure. Oh, that's what Jesus was just talking about. And exactly a narrative they did not want to think about. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment. So this idea that everything's rising to this point at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy. But when this happened, and we find this all the time, Jesus goes someplace to pray, and the disciples, yeah, we'll go with you to pray, Jesus. And Jesus prays on and on and on, and it's just a little sleepy. Well, when this happens, they're fully awake. Now, as with almost everything here, there's sort of two levels. Because on one hand, 8 days doesn't just mean 8 days, and probably sleepy and awake doesn't just mean sleepy and awake. It probably means that when Jesus was talking before them about what was going to happen to him, they're kind of like, now suddenly, who Jesus is, it's clear in that moment. There's no denying it. They saw his glory and the two men standing with him. And so now Jesus isn't just sort of this figure from the sky all by himself. Jesus is now situated in the whole story of Israel, in the whole story of the Bible. Jesus is not divorced from the Old Testament. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, Moses, and the prophets, Elijah, and they're on a mountain, and it's like the whole Old Testament comes together, and it's all right there. All of their questions about who Jesus is, bang, in an instant, and they can't help but see it, and they still can't even look at it. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, if you think about this is a natural impulse because they've been following Jesus around. Peter has left his boats. This has come at great personal sacrifice. Now, think about this for a minute, because this is an idea. Let's say we build up some shelters up here, and we've got this bright light. And we say, Jesus, leave the wattage on, keep Moses and Elijah here, let's make a building, we'll run down, and the next time it's night, everybody sees this glow on the mountains. They're like, where's that glow coming from? And then we'll go to the town and we'll say, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah are on the mountain, and they're shining with God's glory, and everybody can come up and take a look at them. You maybe have a little rent down, like a tickets. People pay for that. And you know, Jesus, it's cost us a lot to follow you. Reputationally, you're a controversial figure. Right now, you've got everybody's interest, you've got their attention, but we could be vindicated. Because people in town are saying, you know, Peter had a pretty good fishing business and things were going okay, but now he's following that Jesus around and he's not making any money. And, you know, is that Jesus thing really going to pan out and pay off? Is Jesus really going to come through and clean out these Romans? If you'd stay here on this mountain, shining like the sun with Moses and Elijah, then no one would doubt it. Really? No one would doubt it? Because Jesus has done a lot of miracles, and you would think that, everybody thinks, in fact, that, you know, if you do a miracle, no one can doubt it. So let's say, I don't know, let's say we got one of you who is having trouble walking. We bring you up on stage, and I'd lay my hands on you, and I'd pray for you. And now suddenly you're doing a jig on stage. And everybody's like, wow, Pastor Paul did a miracle. And then you'd say, I got to bring my friends to church. And so I'm laying hands on people and doing miracles, and everyone's all excited. You already feel the skepticism growing, don't you? Because we've all seen that act before, don't you? Here's the funny thing about miracles. They don't stick in our minds like we think they should. We imagine that once God answered that prayer, I'll never doubt him again. And 2 months later, I'm doubting him again. That's how we are. So even if you put Jesus, Moses, and Elijah shining like the sun on top of the mountain, and you make it a permanent attraction to the point that even Caesar comes, it's not going to change the world. So the last parenthetical comment in Luke, he did not know what he was saying. Kind of knew what he was saying, but not really. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, And they were afraid as they entered the cloud. Of course they were. This would have been a terrifying experience. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son whom I have chosen. Listen to him." Now, if you take out your concordance and you look at this thing, you'll find this text connects up with all sorts of things. You've got fulfillment, you've got glory, you've got sleeping and then awake seeing glory, you've got Moses and Elijah. The voice from the cloud, we heard that at baptism. And you'd think, a voice from the cloud, if God would speak to me from the cloud, I would do exactly as he says. I don't bet on it. I really don't. Because it's never a matter of believing. It's usually a matter of trusting. So God already told him once from the cloud, listen to him. They're probably wobbly. And it's going to get a lot more wobbly when he gets closer to Jerusalem. When the voice had spoken, they found Jesus was alone. The wattage is down. There he is, looking ordinary. And the disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at the time what they had seen, because who would have believed it? They already think they're a little nuts for what they're doing following him. Now they're going to come back with this story? Their relatives are going to try and lock them up. Now, C.S. Lewis, in his great sermon, The Weight of Glory, touches on this a little bit, because this whole glory business is a little difficult. I turn next to the idea of glory. There's no getting away from the fact that this idea is very prominent in the New Testament and in early Christian writings. Salvation is constantly associated with palms, crowns, white robes, thrones, and splendor like the sun and the stars. All this makes no immediate appeal to me at all. And in what respect I fancy, I am typically modern, Lewis says. Glory suggests two ideas to me, one of which seems wicked and the other ridiculous. So sort of like the guy from the Reformed Journal. Either glory to me means fame, or it means luminosity. As the first, since to be famous means to be better known than other people, the desire for fame appears to me competitive, a competitive passion, and therefore of hell rather than heaven. As for the second, who wishes to be a kind of a living human light bulb? And he's got a point. Okay, Jesus shines like the sun. So what? Is that really a bigger deal than raising the dead or helping the lame to walk? Those at least seem to have immediate payouts. Shining like the sun, well, in the ancient world you needed fire for that. Now we got all this light. We have seemed to this light bulbs are better than Jesus. You turn them on, you turn them off. They're reliable. Now, again, you might be wondering, what was I doing in Europe? And what do my groups look like? Well, they kind of look like this. They're just kind of ordinary people from sort of all over the world, and London's a very cosmopolitan place. You've got people from all over the world living in London. And you say, well, what does Paul do over in those estuary groups? I'd say, well, if you're curious, 9 a.m. over in here, that little room across the way, you can find out. We do it every week. But I took a few minutes. I had a few extra minutes in London, and so I took a walk. And it was a rainy day. I took my umbrella. And they got these big 3 parks. They're all connected. Kensington Park and Hyde Park and Green Park. And I see on my little map, there's this monument to Prince Albert. And I'm like, I don't know who Prince Albert is. And I get there, and it's this massive thing. It's like, oh my goodness, look at this thing. Now, the Victorians really knew how to do monuments. This thing is massive. And it's got gold leaf, and it's full of symbolism. And I mean, when I got there, it's like, oh my goodness, I've never seen or heard of this thing. But here it is, and hardly anybody paying any attention to it. So then, of course, I got to figure out, well, who is Prince Albert? Well, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was born August 26, 1819, in Schloss Resenau, Germany. He married his first cousin, this is a little icky, married his first cousin, Queen Victoria. Oh, I heard about her. on February 10, 1840, and became the Prince Consort of the United Kingdom. Okay, he's the Prince Consort, which means he's not king, actually. He's the Queen's husband. Just like Camilla Bowles is now the consort. I don't know, she's the consort of the king. So they have all words for this. I don't understand it. You can look it up on the internet. I don't really care. But who was this Albert? Because look at him. He's shining like the sun. And it was kind of a cloudy day, and we had rain back and forth. And he's there, and it's dark, but it's just dramatic. Albert was known for his support of public causes, such as educational reform and the abolition of slavery. Wow, I didn't know that. He played a significant role in the organization of the Great Exhibition of 1851 and was a trusted advisor to Queen Victoria. Albert passed away on December 14, 1861 at the age of 42. Died young. Was only married 21 years. She must have really loved him. The Albert Memorial in London was commissioned by Queen Victoria in memory of her beloved husband, Prince Albert. The memorial, designed by Sir George Gilbert Scott, was located in Kensington Gardens. That's where I was, directly north of the Royal Albert Hall. I saw that too. Construction began in 1864. It's during the American Civil War. And the memorial was officially unveiled in 1872, but then they seated him in 1876. And when you look at the statue, it's a huge statue, completely covered with gold leaf, and certainly not like lightning in the story of Transfiguration, but he shines. It's like, huh. What's interesting about it is that their four corners of the monument have four continents on which at that point, the British Empire, the sun never set on the British Empire, so this is the monument to Asia. So you have an Asian elephant, and you have someone that looks Chinese, and people who look Indian. So they had the Asian continent, the African continent, the American continent, and the European continent. And the whole thing gets put together, and there's a cross on top. And then there are angels underneath the cross. And then you've got Albert sort of within this churchy, cathedral type area, and then you've got little people around, and this is a picture of the whole world. Wow, they really know how to do monuments. This story is a revelation of the whole world. The law and the prophets, Jesus on a mountain shining like the sun. That's what the story is about. This is my son whom I have chosen. Listen to him, the voice from the cloud says. The eighth day, the disciples, before they have to walk into the fiery furnace. A little later in the chapter, Jesus will set his face to Jerusalem, and Jesus will head to Jerusalem. And even though they just saw him shining like the sun, even though they just had this moment of revelation when Peter's like, let's build a shrine, they're about to forget all of this. And when the heat comes down, they're going to abandon him. Carol mentioned in the liturgical calendar, Lent starts. This is to say, before we go into the darkness, don't forget the light. But what does Messiahship look like? The Son of God must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders. And he must be killed and on the third day rise again to life. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Right now in the world, there's a lot of people wanting to save their lives. And they're going to lose them. But whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their very self? Now, would you want your wife of 21 years, or your cousin, who's also actually your cousin too, making a monument about you? Yeah, that's kind of nice. It means, boy, she loved him. She loved him a lot. She loved him a whole lot. Look at what she built for him. And her monument's pretty cool. It's actually right out in front of Buckingham Palace, another really amazing monument. One of the things that I noticed, though, as I walked around and saw the monuments, that one of the things that you notice when you get to England is that they've got a lot of monuments from the First World War. Because a whole generation of men were wiped out in that First World War. And while the monuments from the Victorian era are all optimistic and glorious, that monument with those soldiers, those doughboys, there's no cross hardly on the top of that monument. It's just almost as if when the First World War came, it's like the heavens closed and they suffered and they didn't see much glory. And this is where we get into Christ's strange messiahship. Worked a lot faster than Prince Albert, but also slower in some ways. Jesus claims the whole world, edge to edge, top to bottom. He's on the mountain shining like the sun, and before you know it, he's going to be on a cross, naked, killed like a slave. And Jesus says, I am saving the world, top to bottom, end to end. I am taking the whole thing. Now, I'm just learning about Albert. Didn't know anything about him. He was very famous at one point, but Jesus is way, 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 way more famous. Albert might have been a great guy, and I just told you a little bit about his story, and I'm just reading a book now to learn a little bit about him. It's kind of interesting. But here we are today, looking to Jesus for help. That's way more famous. That's way bigger. And the thing is, Albert died a prince. Jesus was killed like a slave. Now, here's the funny thing. It's a really cool thing to have Albert's monument in London. And when I die, if my wife outlives me, I'm not expecting anything that big. Maybe just a little service, something, I don't know. But who are Jesus' monuments? Now we've got crosses, we've got churches, we've got all of these things. But you are his monuments. Why go to London, and why go to Germany, and why go to Netherlands, and why go to Ireland, and why we do that in that room, and why we do this in this room is because you will be my witnesses. Now we're not in gold leaf. I'm not shining like the sun. We're not molded by a grieving monarch, but we're molded by his spirit that's gone into the world. And Jesus is taking shape in people. Now, we're all fallible witnesses. We don't get him right. He's way bigger than we are. We can't quite get the entire dynamic range of his glory. But this is exactly Jesus' plan. You will be my witnesses. Out of the cloud, this is my son, listen to him. Well, what does he say? Well, on the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And he said, this is my body broken for you. What does that have to do with us? That's what he did. Then he says, do this in remembrance of me. Well, did he mean eat the bread? Yeah, we're about to do that. He meant that. But what else does that mean? It means I'm giving my life for you. I want you to give your lives for each other. Amen.